Withan,
Yeah.
you started Advanta-STAR in the early 90s. What led you in those early years to come up with the concept of Advanta-STAR, what has become now the premier automotive research company in America?
Well, I had a position as a training and inventory manager at a dealership, and we were just opening up. So I was ordering all of the new inventory, trying to balance it correctly, get the good units in. And while me and the general manager and the dealer principal were sitting up in the podium, uh, a car carrier rolled up in the lot, and we saw it was covered in Dodge Omnis. This was 1990, so it was the very last year the Dodge Omni was produced. And there had to have been a dozen on there easily because it was a small car. And we're discussing, what went wrong. And turns out back then, at least, the OEM, the manufacturer, could order cars for you behind your back and just have them shipped out. And while we're making
They pretty
calls
much
and trying
dumped
to,
all that on you, right?
yep, dumped it right up. Well, that was the worst part. So the as we're sitting there discussing it and calling people and panicking, another car carrier rolls up with another dozen Dodge Omni. So all told, by the end of the day, uh, we had a 3-year supply of Dodge Omnis in the dealership. We had more Dodge Omnis than probably has ever been in one place except the factory at one time in the previous history of the world.
So basically, as a new dealer, they took everything that was sitting on the table and said, just send it to
Yeah,
those guys, right?
push it off on them. They'll have
Good luck.
Yeah,
they'll have
yeah,
no way of dealing with it.
yeah,
And
exactly.
the thing is, we had a bunch of brand new salespeople, and we had a bunch of seasoned professionals, but they weren't seasoned professionals at selling Dodge Omnis. They were from Toyota and Honda and different places like that.
Yeah.
And they
So they
looked at
weren't
these
familiar with the
cars.
product whatsoever, right? They were just totally green like everybody else.
Oh, any familiarity they had with the product was like, if I get too close to this thing, I'm going to catch a disease.
But but
'Cause,
but you had some familiarity with it personally, though, right?
oh yeah, because I had been in that make for quite a while, and I'd sold them for years. And once I did a little research on them because in my position as trainer, I also needed to bring people up to speed on the product knowledge with these units. I determined that it actually had a large number of uh, market advantages against its competitive set, which back in the day would have been things like Excels and uh, Tercels and Sentras and things.
So pretty much the Toyota, Honda, Hyundai competitors, and then even some of the domestics,
Oh
you
yeah,
know, you
Escort and
yeah,
Cavalier and such.
you saw from being the corporate trainer for the company that, there were merits to these products, even though to the public or to the OEM, they really were having difficulty moving the product. But you saw there were some things that you could, if you highlighted enough of them, that they would make them more marketable, correct?
Yeah, especially the salespeople weren't familiar with any advantages on these cars. I mean, this was one of the well in its price class. This was the first car to have a driver's side airbag, and it was standard. In the NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration crash tests, it did better than any of the small cars. Partially due to the driver's airbag, but partially due because it had a good unibody structure on it. It had a very powerful engine for its class, 92 horsepower. I mean, that was more than any of the other little cars. It had a lot of, you know, definitive advantages in tests that were run by Car and Driver and Motor Trend.
Yeah, so basically it was just educating the salespeople on these merits that, you in the dealership took that approach, right? And that's kind of what led you to do the research that inevitably became Advanta-STAR. So tell us a little bit about, how you took this approach. So, what did you do with the sales team specifically?
Well, what I did at home alone was I spread out magazines and NHTSA crash test reports and brochures. I went around to all the dealerships and picked up all the brochures on all the cars, and I just listed up on my little old Apple computer all of the different advantages that it had over each one of the specific competitors. Whether it
Mm.
had standard equipment that the other one did, whether it had a longer wheelbase. And then because I was thinking I was dealing with the salespeople primarily, I explained what that advantage meant because you didn't automatically assume that a salesperson would know what a wheelbase was or what it did for the car, because that was also part of what
Right.
I was trying to train up in the sales force. So instead of just listing a wheelbase is 99.2 inches on the Omni and 87.8 inches on the Hyundai Excel, I said for a better ride, for safer, more reliable handling, the Dodge Omni has a much longer wheelbase than the Hyundai Excel, which helps it
So
have
that's where the
that
this
stability.
feature, yeah. So that's where the feature benefit advantage format that Advanta-STAR uses kind of came from. That was the impetus, right?
Yeah, because it was meant to inform about the differences between the two automobiles, but it was also meant to inform what those differences meant and to help train the salespeople, both the new ones and a little bit the seasoned ones, what the different terms meant and how they were advantageous to have different features on them.
When I first started, and that holds true with, and about 35 years ago, I can remember a manager saying, Mike, do you have an evidence manual? And I asked him, I said, well, what is that? He said, well, anytime you see a good article about a product that we're selling, and my career started, I was selling Toyotas and Isuzus. He said, any way you can find a good article about the product, put it in a little folder, highlight the good stuff in yellow, and share that with the customer. That way, it's like, well, you're just telling me that because you sell Toyota. And I said, no, this is what Car and Driver said. This is what NHTSA says. And, when you and I first met, about a year later in my career, you had already come up with this, formatted research so that salespeople like myself, and much like the ones that you were training, they had this information available at their fingertips. So tell me a little bit about, once you gathered all of this information and you put it together in a nice, neat little package, how did you present this to the salespeople and how did they respond to this and, go from there?
Well, we turned into about a 48-page list of all the advantages that the Omni had over each of its competitors. And we made copies and we passed them out and went over it in the sales meetings in the morning. And then the salespeople promptly stuffed it in the bottom of their drawer and forgot about it. And
Typical, right?
that was the end of it. I wasted a couple of weekends where I could have been, going out someplace and having some fun. But then what would occur is back then everyone didn't have a smartphone. In fact, all we had was a desk phone, one of those things you could slam down. And so when they ran out of newspaper and other things to read, they would pull it out and just read it in their spare time. And unfortunately, they didn't really absorb much, except they absorbed one thing, and that was the Dodge Omni was a badass little car that had some really good features and was very competitive in its segment, even though it looked 20 years old.
Hmm.
And they began showing the car to customers, and they had enthusiasm because they believed in it. Because you can't sell anything that you don't believe in. And now they believed in the Dodge Omni. They didn't really know why. And so they would show the heck out of the Dodge Omnis, and they started getting people on them and closing some of them. But if the customer wouldn't close on the Dodge Omni right away, they weren't sure, then the salesperson would start to panic and he'd throw everything out of his desk drawer, find that old rumpled copy, and say, here, read this. And then he'd run away and scamper to the podium and talk to the sales manager while the customer was sitting there reading 48 pages of why he should buy a Dodge Omni. And not 48 pages of fluff, but 48 pages of, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says this, Motor Trend test, it stopped in this distance and the Cavalier stopped in this distance. The horsepower is this on the Omni, and that's 12 more horsepower than the Civic. And, over and over, not only positive reinforcing facts about why the Dodge Omni was better, but objective facts and facts from third parties. So by the time the sales manager sent a closer in or sent him back in, the customer generally had sold himself, and it made the whole selling process so much easier for them.
Mhm.
And to cut the long story short, even though it's probably too late for that,
Mhm.
none of those Dodge Omnis saw a birthday.